Hi everyone. So today we're going to be talking about preparing financials and key point indicators for the TechX case competition. Start off, we're just going to review the typical case components that you follow the structure for your McDonald's case. So first you start off with your problem identification and then your subsequent recommendations. Then you move on to your implementation plan. From there you talk about the financial implications of your recommendations and then finally the risks that are involved. In this competition, the design thinking that you want to incorporate for success in the case should be included in either your problem identification or your recommendations. So today we're going to be talking about just strictly the financial implications, how you could go about preparing your financials and understanding where your financial success of your company analysis is going to come from. So just an agenda for today. First, we're going to start off with an introduction, then we're going to move on to financial modeling methods. From there, we're going to be looking at presenting your financials, and then finally, we're going to be doing a guided exercise showing you how you can go about building your financial models. So first off, what is a financial model? A financial model provides quantitative expectations for qualitative ideas. So what does that mean? Your recommendations are your qualitative ideas where you're coming up with what you think the company should do for future success. And then based on those recommendations, you want to create qualitative or financial implications as to what the cost of those recommendations are going to be, and subsequently what additional revenues are going to be generated for the company. So you're going to be showing the future financial viability of any idea, plan, or program that you're going to be creating for the company, and say how that financial plan could benefit the company for the long run. So when you're creating your financial models, there's a few things that you want to look at to, fully get an understanding of how the financial outlook for the company may be. First, you want to look at the SEC filings. So what the SEC is, it's the Securities and Exchange Commission for anyone who's not familiar. And what that is it has all the listings of public companies' financial records. One of the good things about the McDonald's case, and one of the reasons why we chose this case for this competition, is that McDonald's is a public company. You can buy stock in their company right now, but with them being a public company, their financial records are available. So all you need to do is just Google McDonald's 2018 income statement, and you'll find their financial records for 2018. One thing that you could also base your financial models on competitors' past success. When you're looking at your recommendations, you could look at if one of your recommendations was done by a competitor, try and find an estimate of how much that cost to the competitor was, and subsequently how much revenue they generated as a result. Or you could look at the industry news to get an understanding of how the industry is moving and some of the financial implications that are surrounding the broader scope of the industry. So for your financial models, you're going to be using Excel mostly. You could use Google Sheets for more collaboration, but they work very similarly. So the one thing that we find is important when you're working with Excel, for anyone who's not familiar with it, is cell referencing instead of hard coding. So what that would be, for example, with these 2020 sales is product A and product B. To find the grand total of that first row, instead of doing 200 plus 300, typing those 200 and 300 in manually, you would want to do equals and then click the cell that has 200 and then plus click the cell that has 300. This is because if you need to change that first row that has the 200 and 300 number, if you need to change that first number to say 250, if you hard code it by putting in 200 plus 300 yourself, it's not going to change the grand total. But if you cell reference, once you change the 250, your grand total is going to change accordingly. So organizing and labeling is also important. You want the judges and whoever's viewing your presentation to understand the flow and where your financial models are coming from, what each number is indicated by, and you want to be as detailed as accurate as possible. So with that detail and accuracy, there's a pretty indirect relationship between the two. There's a trade-off that happens between detail and accuracy. So you want to find the middle point of both. So when you have more detail, the model is less likely to be accurate. And this is because the more detail and the more assumptions that you make, the more likely that one of them is going to be wrong. But at the same time, the less detail you have, the more accurate it is. If you're only taking a few assumptions into account, the more likely it's going to be that those are accurate assumptions. So you want to find a good balance where it's detailed enough where people are going to be able to understand where your assumptions are being made and how your model is being driven. And at the same time, you want it to be a reasonable accuracy for the company moving forward. So an introductory to methods of modeling. There's two main models or methods of modeling which we recommend, and for best success, we recommend doing a combination of the two. So the first one is the recommendation approach, and what that is looking at the financial viability of each recommendation individually. So for example, you're going to have your recommendation 1, recommendation 2, and recommendation 3. For your financials, you could look at what the expenses for recommendation 1, recommendation 2, recommendation 3, and then look at a combination of what their hopeful revenues that the combined recommendation is going to be generating. So this is going to be, you're going to be thinking thoughtfully and pretty detailed about each of the recommendation individually. You want to have an estimate of each cost to understand how that recommendation is going to be affecting the company from a financial statement. Also, you could look at it from the income statement approach. It's a little bit more upper level, a little bit harder of a method of creating your financial models, but it's more accurate. So what the income statement approach is looking at the company's income statement, which is one of the public filings for the company, and then trying to create a long-term picture of what the future financial success of the company may be. You're going to look at what their revenue growth was year over year, their expense growth year over year, and then you're going to tie in your recommendations to say, we think these recommendations are going to increase the revenue growth by X amount, leading to more profits for the company. So now we're going to break down just the recommendation approach and the income statement approach just a little further. So first off, for the recommendation approach, the first thing you want to do is understand your idea. What are the financial implications of this idea specifically? How logical is it that that idea is going to happen? And can you come up with a reasonable estimate about what that cost is going to be? Next, you want to classify the attributes. You want to think about your recommendation granularly and think about where the costs are being provided for the recommendation, whether it's you're creating an app, creating a new product, or improving customer services in some way. You want to look at how each attribute of that recommendation may be affected from a financial standpoint. And then you're going to come up with a quantitative estimate for each part. Once you understand those attributes, you're going to come up with an idea of how much it's going to cost, and then you're going to move forward and try to build a fully financial projection as to what the cost for that recommendation is going to be. And then finally, you want to analyze it with the logic check. You want to make sure that what you're recommending makes sense in terms of the company's financial position. So for example, with the McDonald's company, they're a multi-billion-dollar company. They can take on a pretty large expense for a recommendation, so you don't want to recommend something that's only going to have a few $1,000s of costs. You want to think of this large-scale company and subsequently make sure that your recommendations follow with such a large company. And then, so some key steps for the income statement approach. First thing you want to do is gather industry knowledge. Good thing about the McDonald's company and the fast food industry, it should be something that everybody's familiar with. So you should already have a good understanding of how the fast food industry works. But if you need a little bit of a refresher, there's plenty of financial information where you could find how the financial implications work for the fast food industry. Next, you want to research the company's goals and their history. One thing with McDonald's is they're a very old and historic company that's had a pretty consistent pricing model throughout. So you want to be conscious of that pricing model and not totally recommend something that goes against their history. Then you want to use percentages to understand your financials. What this is looking at their percentage of revenue growth, their percentage of expense growth, what their net income margin is, other financial metrics, which you could use percentages to grow out the future of the income statement. And then finally, you want to bring in your recommendations. So even if you're doing the income statement approach, you're expected to kind of show what each of those 3 recommendations are, and thus creating a combination of the recommendation approach and the income statement approach. And then finally, for presenting your financials, you want to, when you're presenting your slides, you want to have graphs and charts or summary figures. You're not going to be showing your entire Excel spreadsheet during your presentation. You want the judges just to get enough of an understanding of what the future outlook of the company may be from a financial perspective. And then your appendix slides is where you're going to have your Excel worksheet or your detailed analysis. So if the judge sees something that they think may be a little off or something that doesn't make sense, this is where you could reference it in the appendix slides and then go to it during the Q&A session if needed.
So moving into some financial presentation do's and don'ts, there are a couple of things that you're going to want to keep in mind when you are presenting and conducting your analysis for your case. So a couple of things is to make sure that you're memorizing a few key data points and you're able to use them during your presentations. This is because you really want to highlight how these recommendations are impacting the firm and really solving the problem. And when you're able to have these few key points memorized, you're less likely to struggle and fumble throughout the presentation, and you're less reliant on looking towards the slide while you're presenting. And it just makes sure, and it just shows that your recommendation is sound and that you understand the financials of which you're projecting. Also, make sure you're comfortable speaking on the qualitative and quantitative aspects. So something we've seen in the past is that students will start with something qualitative like figuring out how much this will increase revenue, and then getting into that quantitative component of really doing the analysis, and can get lost in the numbers. And then it can be hard to find your way back on how this more of a qualitative aspect will affect the firm. So you want to make sure that you're able to speak to both parts, and you can type all your numbers back into the firm's operations as well as its performance. And also make sure, as a tip, that you're not using buzzwords that you don't understand, such as optimization, or maybe a click-through rate that you don't really understand how works. When you throw in a buzzword and you misuse it, it's a quite a clear sign that you don't know exactly what you're presenting, and then that makes us disbelieve a lot of the numbers that you're also presenting. So just make sure you keep that in mind. In terms of don'ts, please don't rely on one team member to answer all the question. This makes it really obvious who worked on what, and can make it seem as if you don't understand your entirety of what you're presenting. And this is not going to go over well with either the client you're presenting it to or whatever judge you're presenting your case to. Also, make sure you never have more than two people answer a question. There usually is only an extreme circumstance of maybe the question being missed or completely misunderstood for having more than two people answer a question, but really definitely do not do this. You don't want to spend too much time on a singular question, because the judge will more than likely have a couple of more things that they want to ask about, and you want to have every opportunity to defend your recommendations. So please make sure you keep it to two people. Also, make sure you're not overloading a slide with too many numbers. Something we talked about in this presentation is keeping certain analysis components to the appendix and highlighting only the key financial data points and impacts on the presentation slide. When you have too many numbers, it's easy to get lost in them and sort of cloud what you're trying to really get at, which is the overall impact to the firm. Moving forward into some professional looking graphs. So on the slide here, we have two examples of what could use some improvement and what is more aligned with a professional graph to present to a client or a team of judges. So in the upper left-hand corner, we can see that this graph could use some updates, as you can see the grid lines on the graphs, which is a little bit distracting. The color scheme and font do not align with the theme of the presentation. We have an orange color that honestly will probably be a little bit hard to see when we actually present this, as well as the font is the set font that comes when you insert a graph into Excel. Whereas on the bottom here, we can see how the bars on the graph are a nice dark blue color aligned with our presentation, and we can see the differentiator for the new model we're trying to look at highlighted in a lighter blue color, as well as that dashed line really showing that we're trying to compare the model to the past models. Also, what's great about the graph on the bottom is that there are labels for everything, so you understand what you're looking at. You have to present a graph as if the person you're presenting it to has no idea what you are talking about. So maybe as in this example, I'm presenting PlayStation value. Maybe the judge or the client has no idea that there has even been different models of the PlayStation. So you can clearly tell that that's what you're comparing by having that label on the bottom here. Something to even improve this further is the fact that there's a value, but there's no dollar sign or unit amount associated with these values. So that could be even more so bringing this graph a little bit further. So generally sticking with some of the leftover tips on the right-hand side here, make sure you're indicating the important dates associated with the graph, you're using those labels, you're taking away that stock formatting so that it's aligned with the format that you used for your presentation, and also always remember the perspective. Some good advice I've gotten in the past is to make sure you're clearing the slide for your audience, so you're really explaining what type of graph you're looking at and explaining the process of why it's relevant, what it's showing, what the goal of the graph is. So make sure you're keeping that in mind as you're presenting. So now we're going to walk into a guided example of financials and how you can sort of get started and different things that you should be thinking about. So one of the examples we're going to look at is a case study involving Marriott. So this team was tasked with establishing and maintaining Marriott's lead within the hotel industry. And one of the recommendations that we're going to focus on that came out of this case analysis was redesigning the public spaces in Marriott hotels in order to appeal to millennials. So when we have this blanket recommendation, we want to have some questions that we want to focus on and answer, especially in terms of financially. So some of the questions that we're going to be taking a look at is, how do we project money to associated with this recommendation and how much it will cost to redesign the spaces and how much money will the company in turn make from this recommendation. And this is a really important question, especially because redesigning a lobby space might not necessarily be something that's revenue driven. And we'll take a look at how we were able to curate and project some revenue associated with this recommendation. We also wanted to look in how well does this fit into the financial projection of the whole company. So how is this going to play into the company's current operations and how will it look like in the future? How will this fit into sort of their financials and their current operations? And then lastly, as we want to do with every recommendation that we pitch, is this recommendation logical and sustainable? Is this something that the company can comfortably take on, or will it be a little bit more so of a risk? So you want to make sure that you're really taking a look at that, because if it's not, you're going to want to have to go back to the drawing board and reimagine what you're trying to pitch. So what we wanted to do is make sure that we're breaking down this idea a little bit further. So we had some key questions that we want to answer, but we also have some key questions about the recommendation itself that will help us build perspective of how to start to examine some of the costs and the revenues associated with this recommendation. So some of the questions that we took a look at for this redesign initiative was, first, within the recommendation itself, what does our target demographic value? What are some things they're looking for in hotels that they're visiting? And how can we incorporate these values into our redesign so that it's on target with the demographic we're trying to reach and it will actually have value to it? Additionally, which hotels will we be targeting for redesign? You want to make sure you're really pinpointed in what your recommendation is and you're as exact as possible. That way your projections are more sound and more likely to be on par with the actual firm. Also, we want to take a look at how we will incentivize hotels to take on this initiative. So some hotels will probably want to decide to save the space on this and skip the initiative, but how can we really bring them in and convince them that it's a great idea to take with their Marriott hotels? Additionally, we wanted to look at some of the associated costs with the reconstruction. So we really wanted to break that down in terms of what will the demolition process look like? How will we repair the floors? How much will it cost to buy curtains for the windows? Things like that. Also, how will these expenses differ between owned and franchised hotels? So that's a question that's really specific towards Marriott, as their current business model has both corporate owned as well as franchise hotels. So we want to make sure that we are incorporating these differences when we're projecting our costs and our revenues associated with this recommendation. And lastly, we wanted to take a look at some of the impacts. So how many customers will be retained as a result, and what is the revenue gained from our loyal customers? So this is really where we're going to bring in the revenue component to this piece and take a look at how this will affect our current customer climate and how it will help retain some of those that are maybe not necessarily coming back to Marriott. So taking a look, this slide is overviewing some of our quantitative justification for this associated recommendation. So as you can see here, this is a little bit more on the busy side. You can see a lot of the thought process that went through our considerations in terms of expenses as well as revenue. So this is something that would be kept to your appendix and not presented. We've pulled up this slide in the past if there was a question about how we got to a certain percentage rate of hotels to renovate and our overall cost. So also something that we took a look at is the customer retention rates used to measure impacts. So as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, this is not necessarily something that is a revenue-driven recommendation. However, we can tell that this will bring in some sort of revenue because there will be a % of loyal customers gained as a result. So that's how you can see on the left-hand side, as each increment increases between loyal customers, how each revenue will in turn increase. The expenses considered by deciding an appropriate percentage of hotels to renovate, and then associate a certain cost with that percentage of hotels. We also found a balance between corporate and franchise-owned hotels in order to accommodate for those considerations. Additionally, this is this revenue and expenses slide a little bit cleaned up, but it still remained in the appendix slide. So as you could tell, the last slide was a little bit busy, and this kind of shows how we could fit this recommendation back into our considerations of the income statement and back into the overall operations of the firm. And the symmetry between the models that we presented and the slides help to convey the point easier and make it a little bit easier on the eyes and understandability of our considerations. So now getting into a slide that we actually presented associated with this recommendation. So we made sure when we were presenting the actual impacts of the redesign initiative that we stuck to just key figures to help show the individual details to our judges, but also kind of leaving a little bit sense of the ambiguity in how we arrived to those numbers. So we made sure we had all of the things in our appendix to back us up, but we wanted to just get those key impacts that were really relevant to show. We also wanted to make sure that we were able to reference individual points of data and then be able to scale it into the big picture of a company. So as you can see here, we have those key points of having 23% of Marriott Courtyards hotels renovated and having that balance between 25% corporate and 22% franchise owned. And then we tied it back into the bigger picture of how this is impacting Marriott as a whole by showing the increase of revenue from loyal customers from 12.5% to 13.75%. So that kind of shows how this is going to tie into the rest of the recommendation. Something that I also want to pause and highlight here is that you can tell that this is more of a conservative number, and this is more on the side of realistic because it's such a small percentage growth, but we do show how it impacts the company as a whole. So you might not necessarily be looking for these huge surges and leaps of growth from a result of your recommendation, but sometimes having something a little bit more on the conservative side actually is more logical and sustainable for the company in general. So taking a look at how we showed the implementation of our ideas, we wanted to work our associated cost and revenue projections back into the income statement so that we could see how it fit with the flow of operations for the entire firm. So taking a look at something that we did, we wanted to account for the fact that the firm, as well as the industry, would be growing as years go on. So we took a look at the growth rate percentages associated with the history of Marriott and used that to project for the upcoming years. And we also made sure to define our revenue and expenses for the individual recommendations instead of doing one lump sum. So that way you could see if maybe you went with one instead of two or two out of three, how it would still affect the firm. Also, each of these recommendations are going to impact the firm differently. So we wanted to show how each would impact the firm by showing them individually on the income statement. And this also helps with making the income statement a little bit easier to read, working from the top to the bottom and seeing how all of these inflows of cash and outflows of cash are going to affect the net income at the end. Additionally, this is another model that we presented in association with our recommendations. So as you saw a couple of slides ago, that was associated with the specific redesign initiative. And then when we came to presenting the financials for this case analysis, we did an overall financial impact as a result of the 3 recommendations over the course of a couple of years. So this graph is clean in the sense that it shows the 2 historical years of the recommendations from before the recommendations of the revenue of the firm in 2017 and 2018. And then we could see how that revenue is going to start to steadily increase over the course of a couple of years as a result of the implementation of these recommendations. Something else that we did that was helpful in this was the fact that we labeled the starting point of the recommendation implementation and the end point in 2023. So you can see how that growth is going to go over time, and you can see what the end result is projected to be. Access alterations and creative coloring can also help to emphasize this point. So kind of as I got at the historical, you could tell the 2018 and 17 are historical because they're in a gray color, whereas the ones impacted by our recommendations are highlighted in red. So that shows a little bit more of the differentiation. Something that's also helpful to do is to include text boxes that summarize what's happening in the graph or the overall impacts of the recommendations. So this is where you can start to tie in those qualitative and quantitative aspects we were talking about earlier in the PowerPoint, so that you don't get lost in the analysis and you're able to tie back how it fits into the firm. Additionally, something that's helpful in terms of answering questions is to have an appendix. So we've been talking about an appendix this entire time. As I mentioned, these are where you can put down your breakdowns of how you arrived at all of your projections. So that's all of your calculations and thought processes behind your recommendations. So this is not something that will be presented. However, there's the chance to pull up the slides in the Q&A session. Additionally, even if your slide might not necessarily get brought up and brought to attention during the Q&A process, there's more than likely the high chance that a judge will go through your appendix independently through the deliberations after you present. And then this way, you can have all of your thought processes lined up, and it really helps support the recommendations that you're pitching. Something that we recommend too is to have a table of contents in a nice way to organize your appendix. This just will save you time rather than running through all of your slides to try to find the one associated with what you're looking for. This will also ease the judge if they look back at your slide deck and are trying to find a certain thing in association to one of their questions. Each team member should really have an idea of what is going on in the appendix and be able to speak to all of the slides while answering questions. This additionally could just be a great resource to back up your thought process while you're answering a question. Maybe you did some of the calculations a little while ago and you need that refresher. It can help you in that talk through process. So as you can see here, some of these slides I weren't even presented earlier in the deck, but we still had them in association with the redesign recommendation. So you could see here on the top right-hand side how we broke down the revenue expenses in terms of corporate versus franchise-owned hotels, and we broke the expenses down even further, accounting for things like demolition, the artwork, the paint drywall of the ceiling that will be happening as a result of redesigning, and then how that all fits back into the income statement.